She spent 23 years building the perfect life, but one look at her husband's new employee made her blood run cold. There was something about the young man with the crescent-shaped birthmark that she couldn't shake, something that threatened to unravel every secret she'd buried. Margaret Whitmore thought she'd left her past behind forever, but some truths have a way of finding you when you least expect them. What she discovered in a dusty attic box would change everything she thought she knew about family, forgiveness, and the price of keeping secrets. If you're ready for a story that will make you question everything you believe about second chances and the unbreakable bonds of love, then you're in the right place. But before we dive into Margaret's life-changing journey, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories like this one will touch your heart and remind you that sometimes the most beautiful endings come from the most painful beginnings. Chapter 1: The Perfect Life. The morning sun filtered through the pristine windows of the Whitmore mansion, casting golden rays across Margaret's perfectly arranged breakfast table. Everything in her world had its place, from the imported china to the fresh orchids that arrived weekly from the florist downtown. At 42, Margaret Whitmore had built what she considered the perfect life: a successful husband, a beautiful home in the most exclusive neighborhood of Millbrook, and a social standing that commanded respect wherever she went. She adjusted the pearl necklace at her throat, a nervous habit she'd developed over the years, and checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. Not a hair out of place, makeup flawless, designer dress pressed to perfection. Image was everything in her world, and Margaret had spent over 2 decades crafting hers with meticulous care. "Good morning, darling," Robert's voice echoed from the kitchen as he poured his coffee. At 45, her husband still cut an impressive figure, tall, distinguished, with silver threading through his dark hair that only added to his appeal. His construction company, Whitmore and Associates, had grown from a small family business into one of the most respected firms in the state. "Morning, Robert." Margaret kissed his cheek, inhaling the familiar scent of his cologne. "Don't forget we have the Hendersons' dinner party tonight. I've already confirmed with their staff." Robert nodded, but she noticed the slight tension in his shoulders. After 20 years of marriage, she could read his moods like a book. Something was bothering him. "What is it?" she asked, settling into her chair with her usual cup of Earl Grey. "I need to discuss something with you." Robert set down his coffee and turned to face her fully. "I've made a decision about the company that I think you should know about." Margaret's stomach tightened. In her experience, conversations that started this way rarely ended well. "What kind of decision?" "I've hired someone new. A young man who's had some challenges in his past. But Margaret, he's incredibly talented, and I believe everyone deserves a second chance." The words hit her like ice water. "Challenges? What kind of challenges, Robert?" "He spent some time in juvenile detention when he was younger." "Nothing violent," Robert added quickly, seeing her expression. "Mostly petty theft, survival stuff. He aged out of the foster system and has been working construction jobs, trying to build a life for himself." Margaret felt her carefully constructed world tilt slightly off its axis. "You hired someone with a criminal record? Robert, what were you thinking? What will people say when they find out?" "People don't need to find out anything beyond the fact that he's a hard worker who deserves an opportunity. But our reputation will be just fine." Robert's voice carried a firmness that Margaret recognized. When he used that tone, his mind was made up. "His name is Jake Morrison. He starts Monday." Margaret stared at her husband, feeling a familiar panic rising in her chest. The same panic she'd felt years ago when anything threatened to disrupt the perfect image she'd worked so hard to create. She'd built her entire adult life around being Mrs. Robert Whitmore, the successful businessman's wife, the woman who hosted charity galas and sat on the boards of prestigious organizations. The idea of having someone with a criminal background associated with their company, with their name, made her feel physically ill. "How old is he?" she asked, though she wasn't sure why it mattered. 22. Just a kid, really. But he's got more drive and determination than men twice his age. 22. Margaret's hand unconsciously moved to her stomach, a gesture so brief she didn't even realize she'd done it. 22 years old. The same age her son would be now, if he were still alive. If she hadn't. She pushed the thought away, as she had countless times over the years. That was the past, a chapter of her life that was closed and buried. She had Robert now, and their life together, and that was enough. It had to be enough. "I just don't understand why you couldn't hire someone more suitable," she said finally. Robert's expression softened. Because sometimes the most suitable person isn't the one with the perfect resume, Margaret. Sometimes it's the one who's willing to work the hardest to prove themselves. After Robert left for work, Margaret found herself pacing the empty house, her mind churning with worry. She'd worked too hard to build their social standing to have it threatened by Robert's misguided charity. The Whitmores were respected in Millbrook, invited to all the right parties, members of the country club, donors to the most prestigious causes. What would the other wives say when they learned about this Jake Morrison? She thought about calling Robert, trying once more to change his mind, but she knew it would be useless. When her husband made a decision, he stuck to it. It was one of the qualities she'd fallen in love with, though right now it felt more like a curse than a blessing. Instead, she threw herself into her usual routine: a yoga class at the country club, lunch with her friend Patricia, an afternoon spent planning the upcoming charity auction for the children's hospital. But even as she went through the motions of her perfect life, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, something that would threaten everything she'd worked so hard to build. That evening, at the Hendersons' dinner party, Margaret found herself distracted, barely following the conversation around the table. The other guests, all successful couples from their social circle, were discussing their usual topics: vacation homes, their children's achievements at prestigious universities, the latest gossip from the country club. "Margaret, you're awfully quiet tonight," observed Helen Henderson, their hostess. "Is everything all right?" Margaret forced a smile. "Of course. Just thinking about the charity auction. We're hoping to raise even more than last year." "Wonderful. Robert's company donated so generously last time. Such a pillar of the community." The words should have filled Margaret with pride, as they always did. Instead, they only reminded her of what was at stake. Their reputation, their standing, everything they'd built together. All of it could be threatened by Robert's decision to hire this Jake Morrison. On the drive home, Robert reached over and took her hand. "You've been quiet all evening. Are you still upset about Jake?" Margaret looked out the window at the perfectly manicured lawns of their neighborhood, each house a testament to success and respectability. "I just don't understand why you're willing to risk everything we've built for someone you barely know." "I'm not risking anything, Margaret. I'm giving a young man a chance to build something better for himself. Isn't that what we should be doing? Using our success to help others." She wanted to argue, to make him understand how precarious their position really was, how quickly reputation could be destroyed, and how difficult it was to rebuild. But she also knew that Robert's compassion was one of the reasons she'd fallen in love with him. He saw the best in people, believed in second chances, trusted in the fundamental goodness of humanity. It was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. Chapter 2: First Impressions. Monday morning arrived with the crisp promise of autumn, and Margaret found herself unusually anxious as she prepared for the day. She'd barely slept, her mind racing with scenarios of how this Jake Morrison might disrupt their carefully ordered life. Would he show up to company events? Would clients learn about his background? Would their friends start asking uncomfortable questions? She was arranging flowers in the front hall when she heard Robert's truck pull into the driveway, followed by the sound of another vehicle. Through the window, she watched as a beat-up pickup truck parked behind Robert's pristine SUV. The contrast was jarring, like placing a piece of broken glass next to a polished diamond. A young man climbed out of the truck, and Margaret got her first look at Jake Morrison. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that looked like he'd cut it himself and clothes that had seen better days. Even from a distance, she could see the wariness in his posture, the way he held himself like someone who expected trouble. Robert emerged from his vehicle and walked over to Jake, clapping him on the shoulder in a gesture that was both welcoming and encouraging. Margaret watched as they talked for a moment, noting how Jake's entire demeanor changed in response to Robert's kindness. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and something that might have been hope flickered across his features. They were heading toward the house, and Margaret realized with horror that Robert was bringing him inside. She quickly moved away from the window, smoothing her hair and checking her appearance in the mirror. Whatever happened, she would maintain her composure and dignity. "Margaret," Robert called as they entered through the front door. "I'd like you to meet Jake Morrison." She turned, her practiced smile firmly in place, and found herself looking into a pair of startling blue eyes. For just a moment, something flickered in her memory, a flash of recognition that made no sense. But then Jake spoke, and the moment passed. "Mrs. Whitmore." His voice was deeper than she'd expected, with a slight roughness that spoke of a hard life. Thank you for having me in your home. His manner surprised her. Despite his appearance, there was a genuine politeness in his tone, a respect that she hadn't expected from someone with his background. Still, she kept her distance, offering only the briefest of handshakes. Of course, she replied coolly. Robert tells me you'll be working for the company. Yes, ma'am. I'm grateful for the opportunity. There was something in the way he said it, a sincerity that was hard to fake. But Margaret had learned long ago not to trust first impressions. People could be charming when they wanted something, and this young man clearly wanted a lot from her husband. Jake's going to be working on the Morrison Heights project, Robert explained, seemingly oblivious to the tension in the room. It's perfect timing. We need someone with his skills. Margaret noticed how Jake's eyes lit up when Robert mentioned the project, saw the genuine enthusiasm there. Despite herself, she found it slightly disarming. She'd expected sullenness, perhaps even hostility, but not this eager determination to prove himself. Well, she said, her voice carefully neutral, I'm sure you'll do your best. It wasn't exactly a warm welcome, and she saw Jake's expression falter slightly. But he recovered quickly, nodding respectfully before following Robert toward the door. I'll see you at the site, Robert told him. 8 o'clock sharp. I'll be there, sir. Thank you again. After they left, Margaret found herself standing in the empty hallway, staring at the spot where Jake had stood. There had been something about him, something that nagged at the edges of her consciousness like a half-remembered dream. But she pushed the feeling aside. She was probably just unsettled by having a stranger in her home, someone who represented everything she feared about losing control of their carefully constructed life. Over the next few weeks, Margaret began to hear more about Jake Morrison than she cared to. Robert came home each evening full of stories about the young man's work ethic, his natural talent for construction, his eagerness to learn. It was clear that her husband was becoming genuinely fond of Jake, and that worried her more than she cared to admit. He reminds me of myself at that age, Robert said one evening over dinner. Hungry to prove himself, willing to work harder than anyone else just for the chance to succeed. Except you didn't have a criminal record, Margaret pointed out. Robert's expression tightened. Everyone makes mistakes, Margaret. What matters is what they do afterward. She wanted to argue, to point out that some mistakes had consequences that lasted a lifetime, that reputation mattered in their world, whether Robert wanted to acknowledge it or not. But she could see the warning signs in her husband's face, the set of his jaw, the way his eyes grew distant. This was becoming more than just a business decision for him. It was becoming personal. The first real test came 3 weeks later, when Robert announced that Jake would be attending the company's annual client appreciation dinner. Margaret felt her blood run cold. Absolutely not, she said immediately. Robert, you can't be serious. Why not? He's part of the team now. The clients should meet him. Because, Margaret struggled to find words that wouldn't sound as shallow as she felt. Because he's not ready for that kind of event. He doesn't have the right clothes, the right background, the right what, Margaret? The right pedigree? The accusation stung because it was true. In her world, pedigree mattered. Background mattered. The right schools, the right family, the right connections. These things opened doors and created opportunities. Jake Morrison had none of these advantages, and Margaret couldn't understand why Robert was so determined to pretend otherwise. I'm just thinking of him, she said defensively. He'll be uncomfortable, out of place. It's not fair to put him in that position. But even as she said it, she knew Robert could see through her excuse. This wasn't about Jake's comfort, it was about her own. The thought of introducing him to their clients, their friends, their carefully cultivated social circle, made her feel physically ill. He'll be fine, Robert said firmly. And if he's not, he'll learn. That's how people grow, Margaret, by being challenged, by being given opportunities to rise to the occasion. The dinner was held at the country club, in the elegant ballroom that Margaret had helped decorate for countless charity events over the years. She arrived early, as always, to ensure everything was perfect. The flowers, the seating arrangements, the lighting. This was her domain, the place where she felt most confident and in control. She was adjusting a centerpiece when she saw Jake arrive, and she had to admit she was surprised. Gone were the worn jeans and work boots she'd grown accustomed to seeing. Instead, he wore a simple but well-fitted dark suit, his hair neatly combed, his shoes polished. He looked respectable. Still out of place among the designer suits and expensive watches of their usual crowd, but respectable nonetheless. Robert immediately went to greet him, introducing him to several clients with obvious pride. Margaret watched from across the room, noting how Jake handled himself, politely, respectfully, but with a quiet confidence that she hadn't expected. When clients asked about his background, he was honest about his unconventional path to construction work. But he spoke with such genuine passion about the craft that even the most skeptical listeners seemed impressed. "Who's the young man with Robert?" Patricia asked, appearing at Margaret's elbow with her usual glass of wine and insatiable curiosity. "A new employee," Margaret replied carefully. "Jake Morrison. He's quite handsome, isn't he? And so young. Where did Robert find him?" Margaret felt her chest tighten. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of: the questions, the curiosity, the potential for gossip. "I'm not sure of all the details," she lied smoothly. "Robert handles the hiring." But Patricia wasn't easily deterred. "He seems different from Robert's usual hires. More rough around the edges. There's something almost dangerous about him, don't you think?" The word dangerous hit Margaret like a physical blow. Is that how people would see Jake? As a threat, a risk, someone who didn't belong in their world? The thought made her feel sick, though she couldn't quite understand why. "I wouldn't know," she said stiffly. "If you'll excuse me, I need to check on the catering." She escaped to the kitchen, her heart pounding. Through the service window, she could see Jake talking animatedly with one of their biggest clients, his hands moving as he described some aspect of construction work. The client was nodding, clearly engaged, and Margaret realized with a sinking feeling that Jake was actually making a good impression. Why did that bother her so much? The answer came to her as she watched him laugh at something the client said, his whole face lighting up with genuine joy. It bothered her because it challenged everything she'd told herself about him, everything she'd used to justify her hostility. If Jake Morrison was just a troubled young man with a criminal past, she could dismiss him, keep him at arm's length, protect her perfect world from his influence. But if he was more than that, if he was intelligent, charming, capable of fitting into their world, then her rejection of him said more about her than it did about him. And that was a truth Margaret wasn't ready to face. Chapter 3: Cracks in the Foundation. As autumn deepened into winter, Jake Morrison became a fixture in the Whitmore household in ways that Margaret had never anticipated. Robert began inviting him for dinner occasionally, usually after long days on construction sites when it seemed cruel to send him home to his small apartment with nothing but takeout for company. Each time, Margaret found herself studying the young man, looking for flaws, for signs that would justify her initial instincts about him. Instead, she found herself increasingly frustrated by his behavior. Jake was unfailingly polite, always addressing her as Mrs. Whitmore, with genuine respect. He complimented her cooking, helped clear the table without being asked, and engaged in conversation with an intelligence that surprised her. When Robert talked about business, Jake listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed he was genuinely interested in learning, not just impressing his boss. But it was the small things that bothered Margaret most. The way he unconsciously rolled up his sleeves when he got comfortable, revealing a crescent-shaped birthmark on his left wrist. The way he tilted his head when he was thinking, a gesture that seemed hauntingly familiar. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, creating lines that reminded her of someone she couldn't quite place. "You're staring again," Robert observed one evening after Jake had left. They were cleaning up the dinner dishes, a routine they'd maintained throughout their marriage despite having a housekeeper. "I'm not staring," Margaret protested, though she knew it was a lie. "I'm just trying to understand what you see in him." Robert paused in his dish drying, studying his wife's face. "What do you mean?" "He's so young, Robert. And his background. Don't you worry about the influence he might have on the company? On our reputation?" "Our reputation?" Robert set down the dish tile and turned to face her fully. "Margaret, when did you become so concerned with what other people think?" The question stung because she knew the answer, even if she couldn't say it aloud. She'd become concerned with other people's opinions the day she'd realized how quickly everything could be taken away, how fragile the foundations of a perfect life really were. She'd learned that reputation was armor, that social standing was protection, that the right image could shield you from the kind of pain that could destroy you. "I've always cared about our standing in the community," she said instead. "It's important for business, for our future." "Jake is good for business," Robert replied firmly. "The clients love him. He's brought in 3 new contracts just this month because of his work on the Morrison Heights project. And more than that, he's good for the company culture. The other workers respect him because he works harder than anyone else and never asks for special treatment. Margaret wanted to argue, but she'd heard similar reports from other sources. Even Patricia, despite her initial suspicions, had mentioned seeing Jake at the hardware store, helping an elderly customer load lumber into her car without being asked. The image didn't fit with Margaret's narrative of him as a threat to their world. "I just think you should be careful," she said finally. "People like him. They're used to taking advantage of kindness." Robert's expression darkened. "People like him? What exactly do you mean by that, Margaret?" She realized she'd gone too far, revealed too much of her prejudice. "I just mean people from difficult backgrounds. They learn to survive by using others." "Jake has never asked me for anything beyond the opportunity to work," Robert said coldly. "He's never been late, never called in sick, never done anything but exceed every expectation I've had. The only person who seems to have a problem with him is you." The accusation hung in the air between them, and Margaret felt something shift in their relationship. For the first time in their marriage, she could see disappointment in her husband's eyes when he looked at her. It terrified her more than she cared to admit. That night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, Robert's words echoing in her mind. Was she really being unfair to Jake? Was her hostility based on legitimate concerns? Or was it something darker, something she didn't want to examine too closely? The answer came to her gradually, in pieces she didn't want to put together. Jake Morrison reminded her of someone, not in his appearance, exactly, but in something deeper. The way he carried himself, the determination in his eyes, the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from him despite his youth. He reminded her of herself at that age, when she'd been young and desperate, and willing to do anything to survive. The realization made her feel sick. The next few weeks brought a series of small incidents that chipped away at Margaret's resolve to keep Jake at arm's length. She came home from a charity meeting to find him on a ladder in their front yard, repairing a loose shutter that had been bothering her for months. "You don't need to do that," she called up to him, surprised by his presence. "Mr. Whitmore mentioned it was loose," Jake replied, not pausing in his work. "Figured I could fix it while I was waiting for him to get back from his meeting. He's not paying you to work on our house." Jake looked down at her, and she was struck again by the intensity of his blue eyes. "I know that, ma'am. I just like to be useful." There was no expectation in his voice, no hint that he was looking for praise or reward. He simply saw something that needed fixing and fixed it. The gesture was so genuinely kind that Margaret found herself at a loss for words. A week later, she discovered him in the kitchen with Robert, both of them covered in flour and laughing like schoolboys. They were attempting to make bread, of all things, following a recipe Jake had learned from one of his foster mothers. "It's harder than it looks," Jake was saying, kneading the dough with more enthusiasm than skill. "Mrs. Chen always made it seem so easy, but I think I'm missing something. Maybe more flour?" Robert suggested, adding another handful to the already overfloured surface. Margaret watched from the doorway, struck by how young Jake looked in that moment. Despite everything he'd been through, despite the hardships that had shaped him, there was still something almost innocent about his joy in this simple domestic task. It reminded her painfully of another young person she'd once known, someone who'd found happiness in small moments despite a world that seemed determined to crush their spirit. "You're making a mess of my kitchen," she said, stepping into the room. Both men turned, and she saw Jake's expression immediately shift from joy to wariness. It was a look she'd seen before, the careful mask that people wore when they expected rejection or criticism. "Sorry, Mrs. Whitmore," he said quickly. "We can clean it up." "I know you can," she replied, her voice softer than she'd intended. "But next time, you might want to use less flour." It was a small concession, barely an acknowledgement, but she saw Jake's face light up as if she'd offered him the world. The reaction was so disproportionate to her mild comment that it made her chest ache with an emotion she couldn't name. The breaking point came in December, at the company Christmas party. Margaret had spent weeks planning the event, held annually at their home for employees and their families. It was always a highlight of their social calendar, a chance to showcase their hospitality and reinforce the family atmosphere that Robert worked so hard to create at the company. She was in the kitchen, putting finishing touches on the appetizers, when she heard raised voices from the living room. Through the doorway, she could see Jake standing near the Christmas tree, facing off with Tom Bradley, one of their longest-tenured employees. "I don't care how much the boss likes you," Tom was saying, his voice slurred with alcohol. "You don't belong here." People like you don't change, and sooner or later, you'll show your true colors. Margaret saw Jake's hands clench at his sides, but his voice remained steady. I'm not looking for trouble, Tom. I just want to do my job. Your job? Tom laughed harshly. You think this is about work? This is about family, kid. This company is a family, and you're not part of it. You're just some charity case that Robert picked up off the street. The words hit Jake like physical blows, and Margaret saw something crumble in his expression. For just a moment, the careful mask slipped, and she saw the hurt, vulnerable young man beneath the determined exterior. You're right, Jake said quietly. I'm not family. I never have been anywhere. But I work hard, and I'm grateful for the chance Mr. Whitmore gave me. That's all I can do. There was such dignity in his response, such quiet strength, that Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't the response of someone looking to take advantage or cause trouble. This was the response of someone who'd been hurt so many times that he'd learned to accept rejection as inevitable. Before she could stop herself, she was moving into the living room. Tom, she said sharply, her voice cutting through the tension. I think you've had enough to drink. Tom turned to her, swaying slightly. Mrs. Whitmore, I was just explaining to the kid here. I heard what you were explaining, Margaret interrupted. And I think it's time for you to go home. She could see the shock on both men's faces. Tom's because she'd never spoken to him so harshly, and Jake's because she was defending him. She was a little shocked herself, but something about seeing Jake's quiet acceptance of cruelty had triggered a protective instinct she didn't know she possessed. But Mrs. Whitmore, Tom began. Good night, Tom, she said firmly, leaving no room for argument. After Tom left, muttering under his breath, Margaret found herself alone with Jake by the Christmas tree. The party continued around them, but she felt as if they were in a bubble of silence. Thank you, Jake said quietly. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Margaret replied, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. Tom was wrong. You do belong here. Jake looked at her with those startling blue eyes, and for a moment, Margaret felt as if he could see straight through to her soul. Do I? He asked. Because sometimes I feel like I'm just pretending to be someone I'm not, hoping no one notices I don't really fit. The words hit her like a punch to the stomach because they echoed her own deepest fears. How many times had she felt exactly the same way? How many times had she wondered if people could see through her carefully constructed facade to the frightened girl beneath? We all pretend sometimes, she said softly. The trick is to keep pretending until it becomes real. Jake studied her face, and she had the unsettling feeling that he understood more than she'd intended to reveal. Is that what you did? The question was too close to truths she'd buried long ago. Margaret felt her walls going back up, her defenses reasserting themselves. I should check on the other guests, she said, stepping away from him. But as she moved through the party for the rest of the evening, she found herself watching Jake with new eyes. She saw how he helped elderly Mrs. Patterson to her chair, how he listened patiently to young Tommy Rodriguez's excited chatter about his school project, how he quietly cleaned up spills and collected empty glasses without being asked. She saw, for the first time, not a threat to her perfect world, but a young man trying desperately to build something meaningful from the wreckage of a difficult past. And despite all her efforts to keep him at arm's length, she found herself beginning to care about what happened to him. It was a dangerous feeling, one that threatened to crack open doors she'd sealed shut long ago. But as she watched Jake laugh at something Robert said, his whole face lighting up with genuine joy, Margaret realized it might already be too late to stop caring. The question was, what was she going to do about it? Chapter 4, Unraveling Threads. Winter settled over Millbrook with unusual severity, bringing with it a series of storms that seemed to mirror the growing turbulence in Margaret's carefully ordered world. The construction season had slowed, but Robert kept Jake busy with indoor projects and planning for the spring. This meant more time at the house, more dinners together, more opportunities for Margaret to observe the young man who was slowly but surely disrupting everything she thought she knew about herself. It was during one of these dinners, in late January, that Margaret first noticed the scar. Jake had been reaching for the salt when his sleeve rode up, revealing not just the crescent-shaped birthmark she'd grown accustomed to seeing, but a thin, white line that ran from his wrist toward his elbow. It was old, clearly from childhood, and something about it made Margaret's breath catch in her throat. How did you get that scar? She asked before she could stop herself. Jake glanced down at his arm, then quickly pulled his sleeve back down. Accident when I was little, he said dismissively. Can't even remember how it happened. But Margaret could see the lie in his eyes, could recognize the careful way he deflected the question. She'd used similar tactics herself when people asked about things she didn't want to discuss. The scar was from something traumatic, something he didn't want to remember or share. Must have been quite an accident, Robert observed gently. Looks like it required stitches. Jake's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Foster care isn't always careful about keeping records of things like that. Could have been anything. The casual way he dismissed his own pain made Margaret's chest ache. How many scars did this young man carry, both visible and hidden? How many times had he been hurt and then told it didn't matter, that his pain wasn't worth remembering or recording? After dinner, as Jake helped clear the table, Margaret found herself studying his movements, looking for other signs of old injuries. She noticed the way he favored his left shoulder slightly, the careful way he moved his right knee, small tells that spoke of a body that had endured more than its share of damage. "You're staring again," Robert murmured as they watched Jake load the dishwasher with the same meticulous care he brought to everything else. "I'm not staring," Margaret protested automatically, but her voice lacked conviction. "You've been watching him differently lately," Robert continued. "Ever since the Christmas party. What changed?" Margaret didn't know how to answer that question. What had changed? When had Jake Morrison stopped being a threat to her perfect world and started being— what? A person she cared about? Someone whose pain mattered to her? The thought was terrifying because caring about people meant risking the kind of loss she'd sworn never to experience again. "I just think he's been through more than we realized," she said finally. Robert nodded. "He has. But he's stronger than he looks. Stronger than he knows, I think." That night, Margaret lay awake thinking about scars. The ones you could see and the ones you couldn't. She thought about Jake's careful deflection when asked about his past, the way he sometimes flinched when people moved too quickly near him, the gratitude in his eyes when shown even the smallest kindness. She thought about her own scars, the ones she'd hidden so well that sometimes she almost forgot they existed. Almost. The next morning brought news that would test everyone's strength. Robert came home from work with a grim expression, and Margaret knew immediately that something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked, setting down her coffee cup. "There's been an accident at the Morrison Heights site," Robert said heavily. "One of the workers fell from scaffolding. He's in the hospital." Margaret felt her stomach drop. "Is he?" "He'll live, but he's badly hurt. Broken ribs, punctured lung, possible spinal damage." Robert ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she recognized as his way of dealing with stress. "The worst part is, it could have been prevented. Someone didn't secure the scaffolding properly." "Who?" Robert's expression grew even more troubled. "That's what we're trying to figure out." "But Margaret, there are going to be investigations, insurance claims, possibly lawsuits. And some people are already pointing fingers at Jake." The words hit her like ice water. "Why Jake?" "Because he's the newest, the one with a record, the easy target." Robert's voice was bitter with frustration. "Tom Bradley is already spreading rumors that Jake cut corners, that this is what happens when you hire people with criminal backgrounds." Margaret felt a surge of anger, so intense it surprised her. "That's ridiculous. Jake is the most careful worker you have. You've said so yourself." "I know that, and you know that, but perception isn't always reality. If this goes badly, it could destroy Jake's reputation before he's even had a chance to build one." The injustice of it made Margaret feel physically sick. After everything Jake had been through, after all his hard work to build something better for himself, he could lose it all because of other people's prejudices and assumptions. "What can we do?" she asked. Robert looked surprised by the question, and Margaret realized this was the first time she'd asked how to help Jake rather than how to protect themselves from him. "I'm going to conduct my own investigation," Robert said. "Find out what really happened. But it's going to take time, and in the meantime, Jake is going to face a lot of suspicion and hostility." That evening, Jake came to dinner as usual, but Margaret could see the strain in his face, the way he held himself like someone bracing for a blow. He was quieter than usual, responding to Robert's attempts at conversation with monosyllables and forced smiles. "How are you holding up?" Robert asked gently. Jake shrugged. "I'm fine. Just worried about Martinez. Have you heard how he's doing?" "Better. The doctors think he'll make a full recovery, though it'll take time." "Good. That's good." Jake stared down at his plate, pushing food around without eating. "Mr. Whitmore, if you think it would be better for the company, I could." "Don't," Robert interrupted firmly. "Don't even think about quitting. We're going to get to the bottom of this, and when we do, everyone will know you had nothing to do with the accident. But what if they don't believe it? What if? Then we'll deal with that when it happens, Robert said. But I'm not going to let you be railroaded because it's convenient for other people. Margaret watched Jake's face as Robert spoke, saw the gratitude and disbelief warring in his expression. How many times had this young man been abandoned when things got difficult? How many people had promised to stand by him only to disappear when it mattered most? Jake, she said suddenly, surprising both men. Robert's right. You're not alone in this. Jake looked at her with those startling blue eyes, and she saw something vulnerable and hopeful flicker across his features. Mrs. Whitmore, I appreciate that, but I don't want to cause problems for your family. I know how important your reputation is. The words stung because they were true, and because they revealed how clearly Jake had seen through her initial hostility to the fears beneath. But they also crystallized something for Margaret, made her realize that some things were more important than reputation. Our reputation will survive, she said firmly. What matters is doing what's right. Over the next few days, Margaret found herself thinking constantly about Jake and the investigation. She watched the local news coverage, which painted the accident in broad strokes without mentioning names, but with clear implications about questionable hiring practices and the risks of second chances. She saw the way some of their neighbors looked at her when she mentioned Robert's company, the subtle shift in conversation when Jake's name came up. It was exactly what she'd always feared. The slow erosion of their standing in the community, the whispers and speculation that could destroy everything they'd built. But instead of the panic she'd expected to feel, Margaret found herself angry. Angry at the unfairness, angry at the assumptions, angry at a world that was so quick to condemn someone who'd already paid for his mistakes. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening. Robert burst through the front door with an expression of grim satisfaction, carrying a manila folder thick with documents. I found it, he announced. The proof we needed. Margaret looked up from her book, her heart racing. What did you find? Security footage from the building across the street. It shows exactly what happened the morning of the accident. Robert's voice was tight with controlled anger. Tom Bradley was supposed to inspect that scaffolding. Instead, he signed off on it without even looking, then went to get coffee. The footage shows him walking away while Jake was still working on the lower level, nowhere near the scaffolding that collapsed. Margaret felt a wave of relief so intense it made her dizzy. So Jake is cleared? Completely. But that's not all. Robert's expression darkened. The footage also shows Tom coming back after the accident and tampering with the scaffolding, trying to make it look like someone else's mistake. The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. He was trying to frame Jake. Exactly. And he almost succeeded. Robert sank into his chair, suddenly looking exhausted. If I hadn't pushed for that security footage, if I'd just accepted the initial investigation. Margaret didn't want to think about what would have happened to Jake if Robert had given up, if he'd decided it wasn't worth the fight. The young man would have lost everything, his job, his reputation, his chance at building a better life. All because someone else's prejudice and cowardice. Where is Jake now? She asked. At his apartment. I called him with the news, but I think he's still processing it. He's been living under this cloud for weeks, expecting the worst. It's going to take time for him to believe it's really over. Margaret made a decision that surprised even her. I'm going to see him. Robert looked startled. Margaret, you don't have to. Yes, I do. She was already reaching for her coat. He shouldn't be alone right now. Jake's apartment was in a part of town Margaret rarely visited. A complex of modest buildings that had seen better days but were clean and well-maintained. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, her heart pounding with an anxiety she couldn't quite name. When Jake opened the door, she could see immediately that he'd been crying. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face blotchy, and he looked younger than his 22 years. The sight of his raw emotion hit her like a punch to the chest. Mrs. Whitmore? He seemed genuinely shocked to see her. Is everything okay? Is Mr. Whitmore? Robert's fine, she said quickly. I came to see how you were doing. Jake stepped back to let her in, and Margaret got her first look at his living space. It was small and sparse, but meticulously clean. The furniture was clearly secondhand, but everything was arranged with care. What struck her most were the books, shelves and stacks of them, covering everything from construction techniques to classic literature. I'm sorry about the mess, Jake said, though the apartment was anything but messy. I wasn't expecting company. It's not a mess, Margaret replied, still taking in the details. It's very organized. Jake gave a shaky laugh. Foster care teaches you to keep your stuff neat. Never know when you might have to pack up and move. The casual reference to his difficult past made Margaret's chest ache. How many times had this young man been forced to start over, to pack his few possessions and move to a new place with new people who might or might not care about his well-being? Jake, she said gently, how are you really doing? With the investigation being over, I mean. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the small window that overlooked the parking lot. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, he said finally. For someone to say it was all a mistake, that I'm still responsible somehow. That's not going to happen. Robert has proof. I know. Jake turned to face her, and she was struck again by the intensity of his blue eyes. But Mrs. Whitmore, you have to understand, good things don't usually last for people like me. I've learned not to trust them too much. The quiet resignation in his voice broke something inside Margaret's chest. How many times had this young man been disappointed, let down, abandoned by people who were supposed to protect him? How had he managed to maintain any hope at all? People like you? She asked softly. Jake's smile was bitter. Throwaway kids. Foster system casualties. People with records and no family, and nothing to recommend them except a willingness to work hard. You're not throwaway, Margaret said fiercely, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. You're intelligent, hard-working, kind, respectful. I'm a charity case, Jake interrupted. Your husband took pity on me, and you've been polite because that's who you are, but let's not pretend I'm anything more than that. The words hit Margaret like a slap because they revealed how clearly Jake had seen through her initial hostility, how well he understood his position in their world. But they also made her realize how wrong she'd been, how much her own fears had blinded her to who he really was. You're wrong, she said quietly. About all of it. Jake looked at her skeptically. Mrs. Whitmore, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but... No, listen to me. Margaret moved closer, her voice gaining strength. You're not a charity case. You're not throwaway. You're a young man who's overcome more than most people face in a lifetime, and you've done it with grace and dignity and strength that I can barely comprehend. Jake stared at her, clearly shocked by her words. And I haven't been polite because that's who I am, Margaret continued. I've been hostile and suspicious and unfair because I was afraid. Afraid of what you represented, afraid of how you might change our lives, afraid of caring about someone who might leave. The admission hung in the air between them, more honest than Margaret had been with anyone in years. She saw Jake's expression soften, saw understanding dawn in his eyes. Why were you afraid of caring? He asked gently. The question cut straight to the heart of everything Margaret had spent decades trying to forget. She felt tears prick at her eyes, felt the careful walls she'd built around her heart beginning to crumble. Because, she whispered, I cared about someone once and I lost him. And I swore I'd never let myself hurt like that again. Jake studied her face with those perceptive blue eyes, and Margaret had the feeling he could see straight through to her soul. What happened to him? Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 23 years of buried grief pressing down on her chest. I had to give him away, she said, her voice barely audible. I had to give away my son. Chapter 5, Buried Secrets. The words hung in the air between them like a confession that had been waiting decades to be spoken. Margaret felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't allowed herself to be since she was 19 years old and facing the most impossible decision of her life. Jake's expression shifted from surprise to something deeper, understanding, perhaps, or recognition of shared pain. How old were you? He asked gently. 19. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. Just a kid myself, really. I thought I knew everything, thought I could handle anything life threw at me. She moved to Jake's small couch, suddenly needing to sit down. The weight of the secret she'd carried for so long felt crushing now that it was finally in the open. What happened? Jake asked, settling into the chair across from her. His voice held no judgment, only compassion, and Margaret found herself wanting to tell him everything. I was in college my sophomore year. I met someone, a boy from the wrong side of town, according to my parents. He was working construction to pay for night classes, trying to build something better for himself. Margaret's lips curved in a sad smile. Sound familiar? Jake nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. My parents had plans for me, Margaret continued. The right marriage, the right social connections, the right life. When they found out I was pregnant, they were, furious doesn't begin to cover it. They said I was throwing away everything they'd worked for, everything they'd given me. Did the father know? Margaret's face crumpled. He died before I could tell him. Construction accident, a scaffolding collapse, actually. The irony isn't lost on me. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. I was alone, pregnant, and my parents made it very clear that I had two choices. Give up the baby for adoption and continue my education, or keep the baby and lose my family forever. Jake leaned forward, his expression intense. That's not a choice. That's coercion. I was 19 and terrified, Margaret said defensively. I had no money, no job skills, no way to support a child on my own. My parents convinced me that adoption was the loving thing to do, that I'd be giving my baby a chance at a better life than I could provide. But you didn't want to give him up. It wasn't a question, and Margaret felt fresh tears spill down her cheeks. I held him for exactly 10 minutes after he was born. 10 minutes to memorize his face, to tell him I loved him, to promise him I'd find him someday when I was strong enough to be the mother he deserved. Did you try to find him? Margaret nodded. When I turned 25, I hired a private investigator. But the adoption was closed, the records sealed. All I knew was that he'd been placed with a good family, that his name had been changed, that he was healthy and loved. And you never tried again? I tried for years, Margaret admitted. Different investigators, different approaches. But the system is designed to protect adoptive families, not birth mothers with regrets. Eventually, I had to accept that I might never find him. Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing her story. Is that why you married Mr. Whitmore? For security. The question was perceptive and painful. Partly, Margaret admitted. Robert represented everything my parents had wanted for me: stability, respectability, a secure future. But I did love him, Jake. I do love him. He's a good man who's given me a good life. But you never told him about your son. Margaret shook her head. How could I? Robert wanted children so badly, and when we couldn't conceive, how could I tell him that I'd already had a child and given him away? That I'd chosen my parents' approval over my own baby? You were 19 and alone, Jake said firmly. You made the best decision you could with the information you had. Did I? Margaret's voice was bitter. Or did I take the easy way out? Did I choose my comfortable life over my child's need for his mother? Jake stood up and moved to the window, staring out at the parking lot. Margaret watched him, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Can I ask you something? He said without turning around. Of course. This son of yours, do you know when he was born? Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. March 15th. Why? Jake turned around slowly, and Margaret saw something in his expression that made her blood run cold. What hospital? St. Mary's downtown. Jake, why are you asking these questions? Instead of answering, Jake walked to a small desk in the corner of the room and pulled out a manila folder. He brought it back to Margaret, his hands shaking slightly. I've been trying to find information about my birth parents for years, he said quietly. Most of my records were lost or destroyed when I aged out of the system, but I managed to get some basic information. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of documents, birth certificates, adoption papers, medical records. Her eyes scanned the pages, looking for, she wasn't sure what. Then she saw it. Birth date, March 15th. Hospital, St. Mary's. Birth mother, age 19, college student. Birth father, deceased. The folder slipped from Margaret's nerveless fingers, papers scattering across Jake's coffee table. She stared at him, really looked at him, and suddenly saw what she'd been unconsciously recognizing for months. The blue eyes that matched her own. The stubborn set of his jaw that she saw in the mirror every morning. The way he tilted his head when thinking, a gesture she'd inherited from her own father. The crescent-shaped birthmark that she'd noticed on his wrist, the same birthmark she had on her shoulder. Oh my God, she whispered. Jake was watching her with an expression of hope and terror. I've suspected for weeks, he said quietly. Little things, the way you looked at me sometimes, like you were trying to remember something. The way you defended me at the Christmas party. The way you came here tonight. Margaret felt the world tilt around her. This young man she'd spent months resenting, fearing, trying to keep at arm's length. This was her son. Her baby. The child she'd held for 10 precious minutes before giving him away. The scar on your arm, she said suddenly. How did you really get it? Jake's expression darkened. Foster home when I was 7. The father had a drinking problem and a temper. I tried to protect one of the younger kids, and he threw a bottle at me. Margaret felt rage and grief war in her chest. While she'd been living her comfortable life, building her perfect world, her son had been suffering. He'd been hurt, neglected, bounced from home to home with no one to protect him or love him unconditionally. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words completely inadequate for the magnitude of her regret. "For what?" Jake asked. "For giving me up? You were 19, Mrs. Whitmore. You did what you thought was best. For not finding you sooner. For not trying harder. For treating you badly when you came into our lives." Margaret was crying openly now, 23 years of suppressed grief pouring out of her. "For not recognizing my own son." Jake moved to sit beside her on the couch, and Margaret was struck by how careful he was, how he didn't assume he had the right to comfort her despite the revelation of their relationship. "Can I ask you something?" he said softly. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. "What was my name? Before the adoption, I mean. What did you call me?" Margaret's heart broke all over again. "Michael," she whispered. "Michael James. After your father." Michael, closed his eyes, and Margaret saw tears leak from beneath his lashes. "I always wondered," he said. "I used to make up stories about who I was before, what my real name might be. You can use it again if you want. You can be Michael again." He opened his eyes and looked at her. "I've been Jake for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to be Michael. But maybe I could try." They sat in silence for a long moment, both of them processing the enormity of what had just been revealed. Margaret studied her son's face, trying to reconcile the baby she'd held 23 years ago with the man sitting beside her. "What happens now?" Jake asked finally. It was a question Margaret didn't know how to answer. How did you rebuild a relationship that had been severed before it could truly begin? How did you bridge 23 years of separation and pain? "I don't know," she admitted. "But I'd like to try if you're willing. I'd like to get to know my son." Jake's smile was tentative but genuine. "I'd like that too. But Mrs. Whitmore." "Margaret," she corrected. "Please. Just Margaret." "Margaret," he said, testing the name. "What about Mr. Whitmore? Are you going to tell him?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. Robert, her husband, who'd wanted children so desperately, who'd grieved with her through years of failed attempts to conceive, who'd finally accepted that they would never have a family of their own. How could she tell him that she'd had a son all along, that she'd kept this secret throughout their entire marriage? "I don't know," she said honestly. "Robert deserves to know the truth, but I'm terrified of how he'll react. Not just to learning about you, but to learning that I've been lying to him for 20 years. Jake nodded slowly. "That's a big secret to keep." "The biggest," Margaret agreed. "But Jake, Michael, I need you to understand something. Whatever happens between Robert and me, whatever consequences I face for keeping this secret, none of that is your fault. You didn't ask to be found, and you don't owe me anything just because we share DNA. Don't I?" Jake's voice was quiet but intense. "You're my mother, the woman who gave me life, who made the hardest decision a person can make because you thought it was best for me. That has to count for something." Margaret felt fresh tears spill down her cheeks. "You're so much better than I deserve. After everything you've been through, after the way I treated you when you first came into our lives, you're still willing to give me a chance. We're both different people than we were when I was born," Jake said. "Maybe we can figure out who we are to each other now." Margaret reached out tentatively, and Jake didn't pull away when she took his hand. His fingers were calloused from years of hard work, scarred from old injuries, but they were warm and real and hers. "I have so many questions," she said. "About your childhood, your life, what you've been through. But I'm also afraid to ask, afraid of the answers." "It wasn't all bad," Jake said gently. "There were some good foster families, some people who cared. Mrs. Chun, the one who taught me to make bread. She was kind to me for 3 years before her husband got transferred. And Mr. Rodriguez, he's the one who got me interested in construction, taught me that working with my hands could be something to be proud of. But there were bad times too." Jake's expression darkened. "Yeah, there were bad times. But I survived them, and they made me who I am. I'm not sure I'd change that, even if I could." Margaret marveled at his resilience, his ability to find meaning in suffering. "You're stronger than I ever was." "I had to be." "But Margaret," he paused, seeming to test how her name felt on his tongue. "You were strong too. You were 19 and alone, and you made an impossible choice. That took courage." "It took cowardice," Margaret corrected. "Courage would have been keeping you, fighting for you, finding a way to make it work. Maybe. Or maybe courage was putting my needs before your own, even when it broke your heart." They talked until nearly midnight, sharing pieces of their separate lives, trying to build bridges across 23 years of separation. Margaret learned about Jake's love of reading, developed during long nights in foster homes when books were his only escape. She learned about his dreams of starting his own construction company someday, of building homes for families who needed them. Jake learned about Margaret's charity work, her genuine desire to help others despite her fears about reputation and social standing. He learned about her marriage to Robert, the love and guilt and complicated emotions that had shaped her adult life. When Margaret finally left Jake's apartment, she felt as if she were walking in a dream. Everything looked the same streets, the same buildings, the same stars overhead, but her entire world had shifted on its axis. She had a son. After 23 years of wondering and grieving and hoping, she had found her child. But as she drove home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, reality began to set in. She had a son, but she also had a husband who didn't know about him. She had a secret that had shaped every day of her adult life, and now she had to decide whether to keep hiding it or risk everything by telling the truth. The house was dark when she arrived home, Robert already asleep. Margaret stood in their bedroom doorway, watching her husband's peaceful face in the moonlight, and felt her heart break all over again. How could she tell him? How could she explain 20 years of lies, 20 years of keeping the most important part of herself hidden? But how could she not tell him? Jake was her son, and if they were going to have any kind of relationship, it couldn't be built on more secrets and lies. Margaret changed into her nightgown and slipped into bed beside Robert, careful not to wake him. She lay staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with possibilities and fears. Tomorrow, she would have to make a choice that would change everything. She would have to decide whether to protect the life she'd built or risk it all for the chance to reclaim the son she'd lost. Either way, nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 6: The Weight of Truth. Margaret barely slept that night, her mind churning with the magnitude of what she'd discovered. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jake's face, not as the young man she'd come to know, but as the baby she'd held for those precious 10 minutes 23 years ago. The baby whose tiny fingers had wrapped around hers, whose blue eyes had looked up at her with complete trust before she'd handed him to the nurse and walked away. She rose before dawn, moving quietly through the house so as not to wake Robert. In the kitchen, she made coffee with shaking hands, spilling grounds across the counter in her distraction. The familiar routine felt surreal, as if she were watching someone else go through the motions of her normal life. How many mornings had she stood in this same spot, drinking coffee and planning her day, while her son was somewhere out there in the world, growing up without her? How many times had she wondered what he was doing, whether he was safe, whether he ever thought about the mother who'd given him away? "You're up early." Margaret spun around to find Robert standing in the doorway, his hair rumpled from sleep, concern evident in his expression. "Couldn't sleep," she said, which was true enough. Robert moved to the coffee maker, pouring himself a cup before settling at the kitchen table. "Want to talk about what's bothering you?" The simple question nearly broke Margaret's resolve. Robert knew her so well, could read her moods and emotions with the ease of 20 years of marriage. He deserved the truth, deserved to know about the secret she'd carried throughout their entire relationship. But the words stuck in her throat. How did you tell your husband that you'd had a child before you met him? How did you explain that the young man he'd taken under his wing, the employee he'd defended and protected, was actually your son? "It's about Jake," she said finally, which was also true. Robert's expression shifted to one of understanding. "The investigation really shook you up, didn't it? Seeing how quickly people were willing to believe the worst about him." Margaret nodded, grateful for the partial truth. "It made me realize how unfairly I've judged him, how wrong I've been about who he is." "He's a good kid," Robert said gently. "I know it took you time to see it, but I'm glad you finally do." The word kid hit Margaret like a physical blow. Jake wasn't just a good kid, he was her kid. Her son, who'd grown up without a mother's love, who'd survived foster care and juvenile detention and countless disappointments, who'd somehow emerged from it all with his kindness and determination intact. "Robert," she began, then stopped. The words were there, pressing against her lips, but she couldn't force them out. Not yet. Not until she'd figured out how to explain 20 years of deception. "What is it, sweetheart?" Margaret looked at her husband's concerned face, saw the love and trust in his eyes, and felt her courage fail her. "Nothing. Just, I'm glad you gave him a chance. I'm glad you saw something in him that I missed." Robert reached across the table and took her hand. "You're seeing it now. That's what matters. After Robert left for work, Margaret found herself pacing the house like a caged animal. Every room held memories of the life she'd built, the careful construction of respectability and security that had defined her adult years. But now, knowing that Jake was her son, everything felt different. The perfect house felt like a museum, beautiful but cold, lacking the warmth that came from family. She thought about calling Jake, but what would she say? How did you navigate a relationship with a child you'd given up, especially when that child was now an adult with his own life and struggles? Instead, she found herself in the attic, pulling down boxes she hadn't opened in years. Somewhere in here were the few mementos she'd kept from her pregnancy, the small tokens she'd hidden away like guilty secrets. She found the box in the back corner, covered in dust and labeled simply college. Inside, beneath old textbooks and papers, was a small wooden jewelry box that had belonged to her grandmother. Margaret opened it with trembling fingers. There, wrapped in tissue paper, was the hospital bracelet from Jake's birth. A tiny knitted hat that one of the nurses had put on his head. A single photograph that she'd begged the social worker to let her take. Jake sleeping in the hospital nursery, so small and perfect and unaware that his world was about to change forever. Margaret sank to the attic floor, clutching the photograph to her chest as 23 years of suppressed grief finally broke free. She cried for the baby she'd given away, for the years she'd missed, for the pain Jake had endured while she'd been living her comfortable life. She cried for the mother she'd never been allowed to be, and the son who'd grown up believing he was unwanted. When the tears finally stopped, Margaret felt empty but strangely clearer. She couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the decision she'd made at 19 or erase the years of separation. But she could choose what happened next. She could decide whether to let fear continue to control her life, or find the courage to fight for the relationship she'd always dreamed of having with her son. She was still sitting on the attic floor when her phone rang. Jake's name appeared on the screen, and Margaret's heart leaped. "Hello, Margaret? I hope I'm not bothering you." Jake's voice was tentative, uncertain. "You're not bothering me. Never. I was wondering, would you like to have lunch today? I know it's short notice, but I keep thinking about last night, about everything we talked about. I'd like to continue the conversation if you're willing." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "I'd love that." They met at a small cafe downtown, far from the usual haunts of Margaret's social circle. Jake was already there when she arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee waiting. "I wasn't sure how you liked it," he said as she sat down. "So I got cream and sugar on the side." "Black is fine," Margaret said, touched by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you." They sat in awkward silence for a moment, both of them struggling with the enormity of their situation. Finally, Jake spoke. "I've been thinking about what you said last night, about not knowing what happens next. I think I have an idea." Margaret looked up from her coffee. "What kind of idea?" "I think we should take it slow. Get to know each other as we are now, not try to force some kind of instant mother-son relationship that neither of us knows how to navigate." The suggestion was so mature, so thoughtful, that Margaret felt a surge of pride. This was her son, intelligent, considerate, wise beyond his years. "That sounds perfect," she said. "But Jake, I need you to know something. Whatever relationship we build, it can't be a secret forever. I have to tell Robert the truth." Jake nodded. "I know. And I understand if that complicates things for you." "It will complicate things," Margaret admitted. "But not in the way you think. Robert's a good man, Jake. When he learns the truth, he's not going to be angry at you. He's going to be angry at me for keeping it from him. Are you afraid he'll leave you?" The question cut straight to Margaret's deepest fear. "I'm afraid he'll never trust me again. I'm afraid he'll look at me and see a stranger, someone who's been lying to him for 20 years. Jake leaned forward, his expression intense. "Margaret, can I tell you something I learned in foster care?" She nodded. "The families that lasted, the ones that really worked, they weren't the ones that never had problems. They were the ones that faced their problems together, that chose to fight for each other even when things got difficult. And the ones that didn't last? They were the ones that let fear make their decisions for them." Margaret stared at her son, amazed by his insight. "When did you get so wise?" Jake's smile was sad. "When you grow up without a family, you spend a lot of time watching other people's families, trying to figure out what makes them work." They spent the next 2 hours talking, sharing stories and memories, slowly building the foundation of a relationship that had been 23 years in the making. Margaret learned about Jake's love of old movies, his secret dream of traveling to Ireland someday, his fear that he'd never be good enough for the life Robert was offering him. Jake learned about Margaret's charity work with children's organizations, work that now made heartbreaking sense. He learned about her love of gardening, her complicated relationship with her parents, her deep-seated fear of abandonment that had shaped so many of her decisions. "I need to ask you something," Margaret said as they prepared to leave. "And I want you to be completely honest with me." Jake nodded. "Do you resent me? For giving you up for the life you had to live because of my choice?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. "I used to," he said finally. "When I was younger, when things were really bad, I used to imagine that my birth mother was out there somewhere living a perfect life while I was getting bounced from home to home." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. "I'm sorry, but as I got older, I started to understand that life is more complicated than that. I started to realize that maybe my birth mother made the best choice she could with the information she had. And now, knowing you, seeing the kind of person you are, I think you did what you thought was best for me. Even though it wasn't?" Jake's smile was gentle. "Who's to say it wasn't? If you'd kept me, I might have grown up resenting you for the opportunities one missed. If I'd stayed with some of the foster families, I might never have developed the independence and resilience that got me through the hard times. Maybe everything happened exactly the way it was supposed to." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "You're remarkable, you know that?" "I'm your son," Jake said simply. "Maybe remarkable runs in the family." That evening, Margaret sat in her living room, staring at the photograph she'd retrieved from the attic. Jake as a newborn, so tiny and vulnerable, unaware of the journey that lay ahead of him. She thought about the man he'd become, the strength and kindness he'd developed despite, or perhaps because of, the challenges he'd faced. She heard Robert's car in the driveway and quickly tucked the photograph into her purse. Tonight, she would tell him the truth. Tonight, she would risk everything she'd built for the chance to reclaim the son she'd lost. Robert came through the front door with his usual smile, but Margaret could see the exhaustion in his eyes. It had been a long day dealing with the aftermath of the investigation, the insurance claims, the damage to the company's reputation. "How was your day?" he asked, kissing her cheek. "Eventful," Margaret said, her heart pounding. "Robert, we need to talk." Something in her tone made him look at her more closely. "What's wrong?" Margaret took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would change everything between them. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you years ago." Robert's expression grew concerned. "Margaret, you're scaring me." "Sit down," she said gently. "Please." Robert settled into his chair, his eyes never leaving her face. Margaret pulled the photograph from her purse, her hands shaking as she held it out to him. 23 years ago, before I met you, I had a baby," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I gave him up for adoption." Robert stared at the photograph, then at Margaret, his expression unreadable. "A baby. A son. His name was Michael, and I held him for 10 minutes before I gave him away." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of 20 years of secrets. Margaret watched her husband's face, seeing confusion, hurt, and something that might have been betrayal flicker across his features. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked finally. "Because I was ashamed. Because I was afraid you'd think less of me. Because I thought it was in the past and didn't matter anymore." "Didn't matter?" Robert's voice was sharp. "Margaret, we've been trying to have children for years. We've gone through fertility treatments, adoption consultations, years of disappointment and grief. And you're telling me you already had a child." Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks. "I know how it sounds. I know how wrong it was to keep this from you. But Robert, I was 19 and terrified, and my parents convinced me that giving him up was the only option. I've regretted it every day since." Robert stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "Every day? You've thought about this child every day for 20 years, and you never once thought to tell your husband." "I wanted to," Margaret said desperately. "So many times I almost told you. But the longer I waited, the harder it became. How do you tell someone you love that you've been lying to them for your entire relationship?" Robert turned back to her, his face a mask of pain and confusion. "I don't know, Margaret. But you find a way. You trust that the person who loves you will understand, will forgive, will help you carry the burden instead of making you carry it alone." The words hit Margaret like physical blows because they were true. Robert would have understood. He would have helped her search for her son, would have supported her through the grief and guilt. Instead, she'd chosen to suffer alone, to build walls around her heart that had kept out not just the pain, but also the possibility of healing. "You're right," she whispered. "I was a coward. I was so afraid of losing you that I ended up betraying you instead." Robert sank back into his chair, running his hands through his hair. "What changed? Why are you telling me now?" Margaret took a shaky breath. "Because I found him. My son. He's been in our lives for months, and I didn't recognize him until last night." Robert's head snapped up. "What do you mean, he's been in our lives?" "It's Jake," Margaret said quietly. "Jake Morrison is my son." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Robert stared at her, his expression cycling through disbelief, shock, and something that might have been wonder. "Jake is your son," he repeated slowly. Margaret nodded. "We figured it out last night. The dates, the hospital, the circumstances, everything matches. And Robert, when I really looked at him, really saw him, I could see myself in his face. I could see the baby I gave away." Robert was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. "Does he know?" "Yes. We talked for hours last night, and again today. He's remarkable, Robert. Despite everything he's been through, despite the way I treated him when he first came into our lives, he's willing to try to build a relationship with me." "The way you treated him," Robert said slowly. "Your hostility, your suspicion, was that because you recognized him somehow?" Margaret shook her head. "No, it was because I didn't. Because he represented everything I was afraid of: disruption, change, the possibility of caring about someone I might lose. I was protecting myself from getting hurt, and in the process, I hurt him." Robert stood up again, moving to the mantelpiece where their wedding photo sat alongside pictures of their life together. 20 years, Margaret. 20 years of marriage, and I never really knew you at all." The words cut deep because Margaret feared they were true. "You know me," she said desperately. "You know who I am now, who I became with you. The woman who loves you, who's built a life with you." "Built on a lie," Robert interrupted. "Our entire relationship, our marriage, our struggles with infertility, all of it was built on a fundamental deception." Margaret felt her world crumbling around her. "Robert, please. I know I was wrong to keep this from you, but it doesn't change how I feel about you. It doesn't change what we have together. Doesn't it?" Robert turned to face her, and Margaret saw tears in his eyes. "How many times did I hold you while you cried about not being able to have children? How many times did we talk about adoption, about building a family, while you knew you already had a son out there somewhere?" "I thought about telling you," Margaret said weakly. "Every time we talked about adoption, every time we went through another failed treatment, I thought about it. But I was so afraid." "Of what? Of me? Did you really think so little of me that you believed I'd judge you for a decision you made as a teenager?" Margaret realized with horrible clarity that her fear hadn't been about Robert's judgment. It had been about her own. She'd been so consumed with guilt and shame about giving up her son that she'd projected those feelings onto everyone around her, including the man who loved her unconditionally. "I was afraid of myself," she admitted. "Afraid that if I said it out loud, if I acknowledged what I'd done, I'd fall apart completely. I'd built my entire adult life around being someone else, someone who hadn't made that choice. Telling you would have meant admitting that person was a lie." Robert studied her face, and Margaret saw some of the anger fade from his expression. "Margaret, did you really think I'd love you less for having made an impossible choice as a scared teenager?" "I don't know," Margaret said honestly. "I was so ashamed, so convinced that I'd failed as a mother before I'd even had the chance to try. I thought if you knew the truth, you'd see me the way I saw myself, as someone who'd abandoned her own child." "But you didn't abandon him," Robert said gently. "You made sure he was placed with a family who could give him what you couldn't at the time. That's not abandonment, that's sacrifice." Margaret felt fresh tears spill down her cheeks. Jake said something similar. "But Robert, you don't understand what his life was like. The foster homes, the abuse, the instability. While I was living comfortably, building a perfect life, he was suffering. And you think keeping him would have prevented that suffering? Margaret, you were 19 alone with no support system. You might have both ended up in poverty, or worse. But at least he would have had his mother." Robert moved to sit beside her on the couch, taking her hands in his. "He has his mother now. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Margaret looked up at him, surprised by the gentleness in his voice. "You're not leaving me?" "Leaving you?" Robert's expression was incredulous. "Margaret, I'm hurt that you didn't trust me with this. And I'm angry that you let me believe we couldn't have children when you already had a son." "But leave you? Never. But I lied to you for 20 years. "You kept a secret," Robert corrected. "A painful, complicated secret, that you didn't know how to share. It was wrong, yes, but it wasn't malicious. You weren't trying to hurt me. You were trying to protect yourself from pain you didn't think you could survive." Margaret stared at her husband, amazed by his capacity for understanding and forgiveness. "How can you be so calm about this?" Robert's smile was sad. "Because I love you, Margaret. All of you, including the parts you've been afraid to show me. And because—" he paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Because Jake is an extraordinary young man, and if he's your son, then in a way, he's mine too." The words hit Margaret like a revelation. "You want to be part of this? Part of his life?" "If he'll have me," Robert said simply. "I've grown to care about Jake over these past months. Learning that he's your son doesn't change that. It just makes it more meaningful." Margaret threw her arms around her husband, sobbing with relief and gratitude. "I don't deserve you." "Yes, you do," Robert said firmly, holding her close. "You deserve love, Margaret. You deserve forgiveness. You deserve the chance to be the mother you've always wanted to be." They held each other for a long time. 20 years of secrets finally dissolved between them. When Margaret finally pulled back, she saw understanding and acceptance in Robert's eyes, along with something that looked like excitement. "So," he said, his voice lighter than it had been all evening, "when do I get to officially meet my stepson?" Chapter 7: Building Bridges. The next morning brought a nervous energy that Margaret hadn't felt since her wedding day. She and Robert had stayed up late into the night, talking through the implications of her revelation, planning how to move forward. Robert had surprised her with his immediate acceptance of the situation, his eagerness to embrace Jake as part of their family. "Are you sure about this?" Margaret asked as they prepared breakfast. "About having him over for dinner tonight? It might be overwhelming for all of us." Robert paused in his coffee preparation, considering her question seriously. "Margaret, we've already lost 23 years. I don't want to waste any more time tiptoeing around this situation. Jake is your son, which makes him family. It's time we started treating him like family." The simple declaration made Margaret's eyes fill with tears. After years of fearing that her secret would destroy her marriage, Robert's wholehearted acceptance felt like a miracle. "What if he doesn't want this?" she asked. "What if the idea of suddenly having parents is too much for him?" "Then we'll respect that," Robert said gently. "But Margaret, I've watched that young man for months. I've seen how he looks at families, how he responds to kindness. He wants to belong somewhere, he's just afraid to hope for it." Margaret thought about Jake's apartment, so carefully maintained but so sparse, like someone who'd never been sure how long he'd be staying anywhere. She thought about the way he'd lit up when she'd defended him at the Christmas party, as if he couldn't quite believe someone was willing to stand up for him. "I'm scared," she admitted. "So am I," Robert replied. "But I'm more excited than scared. We're getting a second chance, Margaret. How many people get that?" Margaret called Jake mid-morning, her heart pounding as she waited for him to answer. "Hello. Jake, it's Margaret. I hope I'm not interrupting your work." "Not at all. We're between projects today. How are you doing?" Margaret could hear the concern in his voice, the careful way he was trying to gauge her emotional state. "I'm good. Better than good, actually. I told Robert last night." There was a long pause. "How did he take it?" "Better than I deserved," Margaret said honestly. "Jake, he wants to meet you. Officially, I mean. As my son, not just as his employee." Another pause, longer this time. "Are you sure? I don't want to complicate things between you and Mr. Whitmore." "You're not complicating anything," Margaret said firmly. "You're completing something. Jake, would you come to dinner tonight? As our son, not our employee." She heard Jake's sharp intake of breath, could almost feel his emotional struggle through the phone. Yes. Yes, I'd like that very much." "Good. 7 o'clock. I'll be there." After hanging up, Margaret found herself in a whirlwind of preparation. She wanted everything to be perfect for Jake's first official dinner as their son, but she also didn't want it to feel forced or artificial. She settled on making his favorite meal, the pot roast he'd complimented several times during previous dinners, along with fresh bread and the apple pie she'd noticed him eyeing longingly at the Christmas party. Robert came home early, bringing with him a small wrapped package that he set on the kitchen counter. "What's that?" Margaret asked. "Something I picked up for Jake," Robert said, looking almost shy. "I know it's probably too soon for gifts, but I saw it and thought, well, I thought he should have it." Margaret's heart swelled with love for her husband. Even in the midst of processing his own emotions about her revelation, he was thinking about Jake, about how to make him feel welcome and wanted. At exactly 7 o'clock, they heard Jake's truck in the driveway. Margaret felt her stomach flutter with nerves as she watched him walk to the front door. He was wearing the same suit he'd worn to the client dinner, his hair carefully combed, his expression a mixture of hope and anxiety. Robert answered the door before Jake could knock. "Jake," he said warmly, extending his hand. "Welcome home." The words were simple, but Margaret saw their impact on Jake's face. His eyes widened, then filled with tears that he quickly blinked away. "Thank you, sir," Jake said, his voice slightly hoarse. "Thank you for everything." Robert pulled Jake into a brief hug, and Margaret saw her son's surprise at the gesture. How many times had this young man been embraced by a father figure? How many times had someone welcomed him home? "None of this, sir, business," Robert said as they moved into the living room. "We're family now. Robert is fine, or—" He paused, looking uncertain. "Well, whatever you're comfortable with." Jake looked between Robert and Margaret, clearly overwhelmed by the warmth of his reception. "This is all very new for me," he said honestly. "I'm not sure I know how to be someone's son." "You don't have to know," Margaret said gently. "We'll figure it out together." Dinner was both easier and more emotional than Margaret had expected. The conversation flowed naturally, but there were moments of profound significance that took her breath away. When Jake complimented the pot roast, Margaret found herself saying, "I'm glad you like it. I'll teach you the recipe if you want." The casual offer of passing down family knowledge, something she'd never thought she'd have the chance to do, made her chest tight with emotion. When Robert asked about Jake's plans for the future, Margaret heard her son open up in ways he never had before, talking about his dreams of starting his own construction company, his desire to build affordable housing for families in need. "That's a noble goal," Robert said. "Have you thought about the business side of it? The financing, the permits, the regulatory requirements?" Jake's expression grew uncertain. "Some. But I know I have a lot to learn." "I could help with that," Robert offered. "If you're interested. I've been in this business for 25 years. I know the ins and outs." Margaret watched Jake's face light up with an expression of wonder and gratitude. "You do that? Even though I'm not really your—" "You are really my son," Robert interrupted firmly. "Maybe not by blood, but by choice. And that's what matters." After dinner, Robert presented Jake with the wrapped package. "I know this might seem premature," he said, "but I wanted you to have this." Jake unwrapped the gift with careful hands, revealing a leather portfolio embossed with Morrison Construction in gold lettering. "For when you're ready to start your own company," Robert explained. "Every businessman needs a good portfolio." Jake stared at the gift, running his fingers over the embossed lettering. "Morrison Construction," he said softly. "You think I can really do it?" "I know you can," Robert said with conviction. "You have the skills, the work ethic, and the vision. All you need is the opportunity." Margaret watched her husband and son, feeling her heart swell with love and pride. Robert was giving Jake something he'd never had: unconditional belief in his potential, support for his dreams, the confidence that came from having someone in your corner. "There's something else," Margaret said, reaching into her purse. She pulled out the small wooden jewelry box from the attic, her hands trembling slightly as she set it on the table. "What's this?" Jake asked. "Things I kept from when you were born," Margaret said softly. "I know it's not much, but I wanted you to know that I never forgot you. Not for a single day." Jake opened the box with reverent hands, his breath catching when he saw the hospital bracelet, the tiny hat, the photograph. He lifted the picture with shaking fingers, staring at the image of himself as a newborn. "You kept this," he whispered. "I kept everything I could," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "It was all I had of you." Jake looked up at her, his own eyes wet with tears. "All these years, I wondered if my birth mother ever thought about me. If she regretted giving me up." "Every day," Margaret said fiercely. "I thought about you every single day. I wondered if you were safe, if you were happy, if you knew that you were loved even though I couldn't keep you." Jake stood up suddenly, moving around the table to where Margaret sat. Without hesitation, he pulled her into a hug, the first real embrace they'd shared since he was 10 minutes old. "I love you too," he whispered against her hair. "I love you, Mom." The word hit Margaret like a lightning bolt. Mom. She was someone's mom. After 23 years of wondering, grieving, hoping, she was finally, truly someone's mother. "I love you too, sweetheart," she whispered back, holding her son as tightly as she dared. "I love you so much." Robert watched them with tears in his own eyes, and when they finally separated, he stood and joined their embrace. For the first time in their lives, they were a complete family. Later that evening, after Jake had gone home with promises to return for Sunday dinner, Margaret and Robert sat in their living room, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. "How do you feel?" Robert asked, taking her hand. "Overwhelmed," Margaret admitted. "Happy, terrified, grateful, guilty, all at the same time. Is it possible to feel this many emotions at once?" Robert squeezed her hand. "I think it's probably normal when you're rebuilding a relationship that was interrupted for 23 years. You're essentially getting to know your adult son, while also grieving the child you missed raising." Margaret nodded, feeling the truth of his words. "I keep looking at him and seeing glimpses of the baby I held, but he's also this complete stranger who's lived an entire life I know nothing about. How do we bridge that gap?" "The same way any relationship is built," Robert said gently. "One day at a time, one conversation at a time, one shared experience at a time. What if I'm not good at this? What if I don't know how to be his mother?" Robert turned to face her fully. "Margaret, you've been mothering Jake since the day he walked into our lives. You just didn't realize it." "What do you mean?" "The way you defended him at the Christmas party. The way you came to check on him after the investigation. The way you've been watching him, worrying about him, even when you were trying to keep your distance. Those are maternal instincts, sweetheart. You've been his mother all along. You just needed to recognize it." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes again. "I was so afraid of caring about him. So afraid of getting hurt again." "But you cared anyway," Robert pointed out. "Despite your fears, despite your walls, you couldn't help but love him. That's what mothers do." Over the next few weeks, Margaret found herself navigating the strange and wonderful territory of being Jake's mother. It wasn't the relationship she might have had if she'd raised him from birth, but it was theirs, unique and precious in its own way. Jake came to dinner twice a week, and slowly, the formal politeness between them gave way to something more natural. Margaret learned about his love of old movies, and they started having weekly movie nights, working their way through classic films he'd never had the chance to see. Robert taught Jake about business management and helped him develop a 5-year plan for starting his own company. But it was the small moments that meant the most to Margaret. The way Jake automatically helped clear the table after dinner. The way he called to check on her when he heard she had a cold. The way he lit up when she remembered his favorite dessert or asked about his day. One evening in March, as they were cleaning up after dinner, Jake paused in his dish drying and looked at Margaret with a serious expression. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course. Do you ever regret it? Finding me, I mean. Has it been what you hoped it would be?" Margaret set down the plate she was washing and turned to face him fully. "Jake, finding you has been the greatest gift of my life. Not just because you're my son, but because of who you are. You're kind, hardworking, resilient, compassionate, everything I could have hoped for in a child and more. Even though I'm not the little boy you gave up, even though I come with baggage and complications. Especially because of that," Margaret said firmly. "Jake, that little boy I gave up was just potential. You're the realization of that potential. You're proof that even when life is hard, even when the odds are stacked against you, it's possible to become something beautiful." Jake's eyes filled with tears. "I used to be so angry at my birth mother. I used to think she gave me up because I wasn't good enough, wasn't worth keeping." "Oh, sweetheart," Margaret said, pulling him into a hug. "You were worth everything. You were worth more than I thought I could give you at the time." "I know that now," Jake said, holding her tightly. "And I understand why you made the choice you did. But Margaret, I need you to know something." "What?" "I'm glad it was you. I'm glad you're my mother. Even with all the pain, all the years we lost, I wouldn't change it if it meant having a different mother." Margaret felt her heart break and heal simultaneously. "I'm glad it was you too," she whispered. "I'm so proud to be your mother." As spring turned to summer, their family dynamic continued to evolve. Jake started calling Margaret Mom regularly, and while it still made her heart skip a beat every time, it was beginning to feel natural. He'd started calling Robert Dad too, a development that had moved Robert to tears the first time it happened. They established new traditions, Sunday dinners, movie nights, weekend projects around the house. Jake helped Robert with a major renovation of their kitchen, and Margaret found herself marveling at how naturally they worked together, how easily they'd fallen into a father-son rhythm. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came in late June, when Jake asked if he could bring someone to Sunday dinner. "Someone?" Margaret asked, trying to keep the curiosity out of her voice. Jake's cheeks reddened slightly. "Her name is Sarah. She's a teacher at the elementary school." We've been seeing each other for a few weeks. Margaret felt a surge of maternal pride and protectiveness. I'd love to meet her. Are you sure? I know this is all still new, and I don't want to complicate things. Jake, Margaret interrupted gently. You're our son. Your girlfriend is welcome in our home anytime. The word girlfriend seemed to make Jake's blush deepen, but his smile was radiant. Thank you. That means everything to me. Sarah turned out to be a lovely young woman, warm, intelligent, and clearly smitten with Jake. Margaret watched them together during dinner, noting the way Sarah looked at Jake with such obvious affection, the way Jake's entire demeanor softened when he was with her. After dinner, as they sat on the back patio enjoying the warm evening, Sarah turned to Margaret with a shy smile. Jake's told me so much about you, she said. About how you found each other, about what it's meant to him to have a family. Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. He's told you about the adoption? Sarah nodded. He said you gave him the greatest gift possible, the chance to become the man he is today. He said that if you'd kept him when you were 19, he might never have developed the strength and independence that make him who he is. Margaret looked across the patio at Jake, who was deep in conversation with Robert about a construction project. He's remarkable, isn't he? He is, Sarah agreed. But so are you. It takes incredible courage to make the choice you made, and even more courage to rebuild a relationship after so many years. I'm just grateful he was willing to give me a chance. Sarah smiled. He told me something once that I think you should know. He said that finding you didn't just give him a mother. It gave him hope that he was worthy of being loved. That if his own mother could love him after all these years, maybe he was worth loving after all. Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks. He's always been worth loving. I just wish I'd been brave enough to show him that sooner. You're showing him now, Sarah said gently. And that's what matters. As the evening wound down and Sarah and Jake prepared to leave, Jake pulled Margaret aside. Thank you for tonight, he said. For welcoming Sarah, for making her feel like family. She makes you happy, Margaret observed. That makes her family in my book. Jake's smile was soft and wondering. I never thought I'd have this. A family, someone who loves me, a future that looks bright. Sometimes I'm afraid I'll wake up, and it will all have been a dream. Margaret reached up and cupped his face in her hands, looking into those blue eyes that were so much like her own. It's not a dream, sweetheart. This is real. We're real. And we're not going anywhere. Promise. I promise, Margaret said firmly. You're stuck with us now. Jake laughed, pulling her into one of his warm hugs. I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be stuck. As Margaret watched Jake and Sarah drive away, Robert came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. Happy, he asked. Margaret leaned back against her husband's chest, feeling more content than she had in years. Incredibly happy, and grateful, and still a little amazed that this is really our life. It's a good life, Robert said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. It's a perfect life, Margaret corrected. Not because nothing bad has ever happened, but because we found our way through the bad things to something beautiful. They stood together in the gathering dusk, watching the lights come on in their neighborhood, thinking about the family they'd built from the ashes of old pain and the courage to love again. Margaret thought about the scared 19-year-old girl she'd been, making an impossible choice with a broken heart. She thought about the years of grief and guilt, the walls she'd built around her heart, the fear that had nearly cost her everything. But mostly she thought about Jake, her son, her miracle, her proof that love could survive anything, even 23 years of separation. She thought about the man he'd become despite the odds, the family they were building together, the future that stretched ahead of them bright with possibility. For the first time in her adult life, Margaret Whitmore felt complete. She was a wife, a mother, a woman who had faced her deepest fears and found the courage to choose love over safety. She was exactly who she was meant to be. And it was more than enough. It was everything. Epilogue full circle. 1 year later. The morning of Jake's wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect September weather that seemed designed for new beginnings. Margaret stood at her bedroom window, watching the catering trucks arrive and the florists arrange their displays in the backyard, and felt her heart swell with a mixture of joy and disbelief. Her son was getting married. In their backyard, surrounded by family and friends, Jake Morrison, Michael James, was going to marry the woman he loved. A year ago, Margaret hadn't even known she had a son. Now she was the mother of the groom. You're going to wear a hole in that carpet if you keep pacing, Robert observed from the doorway, already dressed in his wedding attire. Margaret turned to him with a nervous smile. I can't help it. I want everything to be perfect for him. It will be, Robert assured her, crossing the room to take her hands. Margaret, you've planned dozens of charity events. You could organize a wedding in your sleep. But this isn't just any wedding, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. This is Jake's wedding. Our son's wedding. Robert's expression softened. I know. I can hardly believe it myself. Over the past year, their family had continued to grow and evolve in ways Margaret never could have imagined. Jake had officially changed his name back to Michael James Morrison, keeping the surname he'd grown up with, but reclaiming the first name his birth mother had given him. He'd started his own construction company with Robert as his business partner and mentor, and it was already showing signs of success. But perhaps most importantly, he'd learned to trust in the permanence of love. The scared young man who'd been afraid to hope for a family had blossomed into someone who believed in his own worth, who could accept love without constantly waiting for it to be taken away. Mrs. Whitmore? A voice called from downstairs. The flowers are here. Margaret took a deep breath, smoothing her dress one final time. Ready, ready, Robert confirmed, offering her his arm. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Margaret found herself in her element, coordinating vendors, solving last-minute problems, ensuring that every detail was perfect. But even in the midst of the chaos, she kept finding herself pausing to watch Jake. He was radiant with happiness, his face glowing with joy that seemed to emanate from his very core. When Sarah arrived with her bridesmaids, Margaret saw the way Jake's entire being seemed to light up at the sight of his bride-to-be. It was the look of a man who had found his home, his purpose, his future. He looks happy, a voice said beside her. Margaret turned to find Patricia, her oldest friend, watching Jake with a knowing smile. He does, Margaret agreed. Happier than I've ever seen him. You know, Patricia said thoughtfully, when you first told me about Jake being your son, I wasn't sure what to think. It seemed so unlikely. But watching him today, seeing how he's flourished this past year, I can see it was meant to be. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes. I used to think I'd ruined his life by giving him up. But now I wonder if everything happened exactly the way it was supposed to. If I'd kept him when I was 19, he might never have developed the strength and resilience that make him who he is. And if he hadn't gone through what he did, he might not appreciate what he is now as much as he does. Maybe that's the real miracle, Patricia suggested. Not that you found each other, but that you both became the people you needed to be in order to find each other. As the ceremony time approached, Margaret found herself in the bridal suite with Sarah, helping with last-minute touches to her dress and makeup. Sarah was a vision in ivory silk, her face glowing with the same radiant happiness that Margaret had seen in Jake. How are you feeling? Margaret asked, adjusting Sarah's veil. Perfect, Sarah said simply. Nervous, excited, grateful, but perfect. Jake is lucky to have you. Sarah turned to face Margaret, her expression serious. Mrs. Whitmore, Margaret, I need you to know something. Jake told me about his childhood, about the foster homes and the uncertainty. He said that for most of his life, he didn't believe he deserved to be loved. But you changed that. You and Mr. Whitmore, you showed him that he was worthy of a family, worthy of love. Without that, I don't think he would have been able to open his heart to me. Margaret felt her throat tighten with emotion. Sarah, you've given him something I never could, the confidence to build his own family, to trust in a future with someone who loves him completely. That's a gift beyond measure. We're all gifts to each other, Sarah said softly. That's what family is, isn't it? People who choose to love each other, to be there for each other, no matter what. As the music began and the guests took their seats, Margaret found herself standing at the back of the garden, watching her son take his place at the altar. Robert was beside him as his best man, and the sight of her husband and son together, both of them beaming with joy, made her heart feel like it might burst. The ceremony was beautiful in its simplicity. Jake and Sarah had written their own vows, and as Margaret listened to her son promise to love, honor, and cherish his bride, she was struck by the maturity and depth of his words. This wasn't a young man making promises he didn't understand. This was a man who had learned the value of commitment, who understood that love was a choice you made every day. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Jake kissed his bride for the first time as her husband, Margaret felt 24 years of grief and guilt finally, completely heal. Her son was loved. He was happy. He was home. During the reception, as Margaret watched Jake and Sarah dance their first dance as husband and wife, Robert appeared at her elbow with 2 glasses of champagne. To our son, he said, raising his glass. To our son, Margaret echoed, clinking her glass against his. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the young couple sway to the music, lost in each other and their joy. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if things had been different? Robert asked. If you'd kept him when he was born, if we'd met under different circumstances? Margaret considered the question. Sometimes. But then I look at who he is now, at the man he's become, and I think everything happened exactly the way it was supposed to. The pain, the separation, the years of not knowing, it all led to this moment. To him being exactly who he is, exactly where he's supposed to be. No regrets. Margaret watched Jake spin Sarah around the dance floor, both of them laughing with pure joy. No regrets, she said firmly. Only gratitude. Later in the evening, as the party was winding down, Jake found Margaret sitting at one of the tables, watching the last few couples dance under the string lights they'd hung throughout the garden. Mind if I sit? He asked. Of course not, Margaret said, patting the chair beside her. Shouldn't you be with your wife? Jake's smile was radiant. My wife. I don't think I'll ever get tired of saying that. You shouldn't. It's a beautiful thing, being married to someone you love. Jake was quiet for a moment, watching Sarah chat with some of their friends across the garden. Margaret, I need to tell you something. What's that? Thank you. For all of this, for welcoming Sarah into the family, for making this day perfect. But mostly, thank you for finding the courage to tell me who you were. For giving me the chance to have a mother. Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks. Jake, Michael, you don't need to thank me. You're my son. This is what mothers do. But you didn't have to be my mother, Jake said gently. You could have kept the secret, could have let me go on being just Robert's employee. You chose to risk everything to claim me as your son. That took incredible courage. Margaret reached over and took his hand, noting how strong and capable it had become, how different it was from the tiny fingers that had once wrapped around hers in a hospital room 24 years ago. You know what I've learned this past year? She said softly. Being your mother isn't something I chose to do. It's something I've always been. From the moment you were born, from the moment I held you for those 10 minutes, I was your mother. The only choice I had was whether to acknowledge it or keep hiding from it. Jake squeezed her hand. I'm glad you chose to acknowledge it. So am I. More than you'll ever know. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last of the wedding guests enjoy the evening. Margaret thought about all the moments she'd missed. First steps, first words, birthdays, graduations, heartbreaks, triumphs. She thought about the years of wondering and worrying, of carrying a secret that had shaped every day of her adult life. But she also thought about the moments they'd gained. Quiet dinners where Jake shared his dreams, movie nights where they discovered shared tastes in old films, the day he'd first called her mom, without hesitation. She thought about watching him fall in love with Sarah, about seeing him build his business with Robert's guidance, about witnessing him transform from a guarded young man into someone who believed in his own worth. I have something for you, Jake said suddenly, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small wrapped box and handed it to her. Jake, you didn't need to get me anything. Open it, he said, his eyes bright with anticipation. Margaret unwrapped the box with careful fingers, gasping when she saw what was inside. It was a locket, antique silver with delicate engraving around the edges. She opened it with trembling hands and found 2 photographs inside. One of Jake as a baby, the same photo she'd kept hidden for 23 years, and one of their family taken just last month, all 3 of them laughing at something Robert had said. How did you? I had copies made of the baby photo, Jake explained. I wanted you to have something that showed our whole story, where we started and where we are now. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she studied the locket. It's perfect. It's absolutely perfect. There's an inscription on the back, Jake said softly. Margaret turned the locket over and read the words engraved in elegant script. Love never ends. Your son, Michael. Oh, sweetheart, Margaret whispered, pulling Jake into a fierce hug. I love you so much. I love you too, Mom, Jake said, holding her tightly. Thank you for never giving up on finding me, even when you didn't know you were looking. As the evening drew to a close and the last guests departed, Margaret found herself standing in her garden, now transformed by the remnants of the wedding celebration. Robert was directing the cleanup crew, and Jake and Sarah were saying goodbye to their friends before leaving for their honeymoon. Margaret fingered the locket at her throat, thinking about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. 24 years ago, she'd been a frightened teenager making an impossible choice. 20 years ago, she'd been a young wife building a life on a foundation of secrets. 1 year ago, she'd been a woman terrified of losing everything she'd worked to create. Now, she was simply a mother watching her son begin his own family, surrounded by love and hope and the promise of a future bright with possibility. "Ready to go inside?" Robert asked, appearing at her side as the last of the vendors packed up their equipment. Margaret looked around the garden one more time, memorizing the scene. Tomorrow, it would be back to normal, just their backyard again. But tonight, it had been the place where their son had married the woman he loved, where their family had celebrated a new beginning. "Almost," she said. "I just want to remember this moment." Robert wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood together in the quiet garden, surrounded by the lingering magic of the evening. "Any regrets?" Robert asked, echoing their conversation from earlier. Margaret thought about the question seriously. She thought about the pain of giving up her baby, the years of secrecy and guilt, the fear that had nearly cost her everything. She thought about Jake's difficult childhood, the suffering he'd endured while she'd been living her comfortable life. But she also thought about the man Jake had become because of those experiences, strong, compassionate, resilient, grateful for every blessing. She thought about the family they'd built together, not despite their past but because of it. She thought about the love that had survived 23 years of separation and emerged stronger than ever. "No regrets," she said finally. "Only gratitude for the journey that brought us here." As they walked toward the house, Margaret caught sight of Jake and Sarah in the driveway, loading their suitcases into the car for their honeymoon trip. Jake looked up and saw her watching, and his face broke into the radiant smile that never failed to make her heart skip a beat. "Love you, Mom," he called out, waving. "Love you too, sweetheart," Margaret called back, her voice carrying across the quiet night air. As Jake and Sarah drove away, their car disappearing around the corner, Margaret felt a sense of completion that she'd never experienced before. Her son was loved, happy, and building a life of his own. Her marriage was stronger than ever, built now on complete honesty and trust. Her family was whole. She thought about the scared 19-year-old girl who'd made an impossible choice in a hospital room 24 years ago. That girl had thought she was ending a story, closing a chapter that could never be reopened. She'd had no way of knowing that she was actually beginning a story of love that would survive separation, of family that would transcend biology, of second chances that could heal even the deepest wounds. Margaret Whitmore, wife, mother, woman who had learned that love truly never ends, walked into her house with her husband, ready to begin the next chapter of their story. Behind them, the garden held the lingering magic of a perfect day, and ahead of them stretched a future bright with the promise of grandchildren to spoil, holidays to celebrate, and a lifetime of moments to share with the son who had found his way home at last. In the end, Margaret realized some stories don't have endings, they just have new beginnings. And this was theirs. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about your own family or the power of second chances, then you're part of our community now. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because we have more incredible stories of love, redemption, and the extraordinary power of the human spirit coming your way. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late for a new beginning. And remember, sometimes the family we're meant to have is worth waiting a lifetime to find. The end.